Wait, how do you... I can't do it. It's time for Sound Politics. I spit out my mouth. Did you see that? I hope nobody saw that. I spit everywhere.
Before we start, Sarah, are you recording? I just want to...
Yep, I am recording.
You can edit that together, right, Hans?
You getting this gold?
Okay, this is gold. Sarah, don't lose this. This is going to be for your reel. Okay? This is going to be important later in your career.
This will be your sizzle
Oh,
reel.
yeah.
Exactly.
This is a career maker right here.
It's time for Sound Politics. This is Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. And we're here with Sarah Mises Tan, KUOW State House reporter. It's the 3-seater today.
Hey.
Sarah, thanks for being here.
Hello, it's good to be back.
To start off, I have a question for you two. When you read stories about the U.S. Supreme Court, like the shadow docket, the ethics scandals, the exceedingly low polling numbers of Americans' trust in the institution of the Supreme Court, do you ever just think, would this whole thing be better if we elected these people? If you and I voted on, Sonia Sotomayor, Brett Kavanaugh, the rest of them?
Better in terms of partisanship or in terms of like the considered, thoughtful, rational consideration of issues? Like what is better in your definition?
I guess it's like we're acting.
Would accountability be improved?
Maybe we'd just be more honest about whether or not it was political, right? Because now we're acting like, oh, it's not political and these people are in until they die. Maybe it would be, I don't know.
They're supposed to be these like sages on the mount. And instead we would just acknowledge that they are partisan creatures just like all the other people in Washington.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of Washington, well, not that Washington, but this Washington, we actually sort of know the answer to my question, kinda, because we do elect our state Supreme Court justices. And this year, we are electing more than maybe ever before in our history.
Yeah, I mean, our state Supreme Court just doesn't get the kind of spotlight that the U.S. Supreme Court does, the one in D.C.
Right.
I mean, very few people pay attention to the 9 justices here in the Evergreen state, certainly not to their elections.
Yeah.
I mean, in 2024, 2 of the 3 judges ran unopposed.
Yeah. These races tend to be pretty obscure, but they're important, especially in this year, because you get one guess at what giant question is about to come up before the state Supreme Court. Let's all say it together.
The
millionaires tax. Oh, wow, we sounded so excited.
We could start a boy band.
But despite how our tone just then on the millionaires tax, we are not talking about the millionaires tax today. We are excited to talk about the state Supreme Court because it is extremely important and most people don't pay attention. So we're going to talk about why you should and why it is one of the most important races on your ballot this year. Let's get into it on Sound Politics after a quick break.
We're back with Sound Politics. Today with Sarah Mises Tan, along with me and Scott Greenstone. I'm Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Scott Greenstone. And with the legislative session over, all the action has moved from the legislative building where you are, Sarah, right, in the basement.
Yes.
Sort of in the basement by the
Very
gift shop.
Very glamorous. Yes.
I'm doxing you right now.
Come on by.
We're gonna go up the stairs out of the legislative building, across the parking lot to the Temple of Justice, which is busy now that the legislative session is over, with a bunch of lawsuits related to the legislative session. So we have talked, Sarah, about the various legal challenges to the millionaires tax that the legislature passed. There was the question of one that Brian Haywood wants to move forward with. He wants to do a referendum on the tax. Can he do that? There's another challenge from the Citizen Action Defense Fund, which Haywood funds in part. That's led by former Attorney General Rob McKenna. These cases are likely to end up before the state Supreme Court. And a majority of people who, of course, are in the Temple of Justice, I should say, a majority of people who are going to decide, who sit in that Temple of Justice and decide these cases are now on the ballot this year. We have not yet reached the filing deadline. I think that's first week in May. Is that right?
I think it's like May 8th.
Yeah, so we're
Yep,
2
yep.
weeks away from the filing deadline. Candidates can still decide to run, but Sarah, what do we know so far about this super important, super obscure election?
Yes, the perfect combination there. So there are a few judges who have retired, and there are also some judges whose terms are expiring at the end of this year. All of this culminates into there being a remarkable 5 seats up for election this year, something that experts say hasn't happened in recent memory. It's so rare. I believe we can say it hasn't happened in recordable history. Is that fair to say?
I asked around about this just to try and make sure. I asked the Secretary of State and the Secretary of State's Research Library and the Supreme Court Law Library and the Washington State Historical Society. There's no record that any of them had. They did not do like a in-depth search of like the very old records. So I think you might be right. We just don't know for sure without digging through all those old voter pamphlets.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, I guess just to set this the standard here, usually there are about 3 seats up for election. So 5 is a big deal because this means voters are going to have the chance to shape the majority voice of the court. There are only 9 seats on the state Supreme Court.
Wow.
Yeah. And 2 of those races are truly open. There's no incumbent running, which makes them kind of interesting races to watch.
Yeah.
The other 3 races all do have incumbents in them, and those sitting justices do tend to be favored to win. But of course, again, because these races tend to be kind of low voter participation ones, you just never know.
Yes, it's happened. Incumbents have been kicked out before.
So we've got this historic amount of seats on the ballot, and these are, as we've been saying, normally pretty sleepy races. They're down ballot. The candidates don't have party affiliation. Oftentimes, people will leave these races blank on their ballots. But people who fill these Washington State Supreme Court seats are majorly consequential. I mean, in just the past 5 years or so, the court overturned the state's felony drug possession law, the Blake decision.
Rewrote our drug policy.
Yeah. It upheld a ban on large capacity gun magazines. It changed how younger offenders can be sentenced in criminal cases. I mean, these are types of big issues that come before this court. And there is this other big, super polarizing issue, this new income tax that will be likely landing on their desks. I don't know, Sarah, are we overstating things by saying the millionaires tax survives or goes down in flames based on who wins these Supreme Court races?
I think that is generally a fair assessment, and I think a lot of other interest groups would agree. I mean, I think this is why this year's races are being so closely watched by interested parties, and also why, despite these races typically being kind of wonky and sleepy, voters should pay attention. Basically, with the timing of the current lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the millionaires tax, the projected timeline is that it will probably head to the Supreme Court for them to make a decision on the landmark case that shapes all income tax in the state at some point next year, which would squarely put the decision of this income tax in the hands of a new court. If folks need a recap, there's a landmark, nearly 100-year-old case called Culleton that has shaped all of Washington's tax code. It stated that income had to be taxed as property, which meant that because of the way the Constitution is written, all income had to be taxed at the same percentage, regardless of how much you made, which basically makes income taxes in Washington state illegal. And that's what proponents of the income tax are up against.
Obviously, these folks who are proponents of the income tax, they want justices who think, you know what, Culleton, that was kind of a weird decision, which many experts would agree with them on. Lawmakers, of course, really want to overturn Culleton.
Democrats,
they want to,
Democratic
Democrats particularly.
lawmakers.
Not all Democrats, but certainly the more liberal ones. Senate Majority Leader Jamie Peterson said in an email that was reported this week by the right-leaning publication The Center Square, he wanted to overturn this precedent. That was kind of part of the point of the millionaires tax.
Totally, yeah. I mean, Peterson hasn't actually really been hiding that from anyone, which I think is notable. Folks who crafted the income tax understood and expected this to happen. And they basically decided to take a gamble. When I spoke with Senator Jamie Peterson in the past, he's the one who sponsored this tax, he believes it's time for the Supremes to make a ruling on the Culleton case and says he feels like this case is just outdated. He points to the fact that the nearly 100-year-old case, that income is property, it's a ruling that has not been upheld anywhere else in the country in modern times. So it's just not an up-to-date ruling, in his opinion.
I should add, I've talked to Rob McKenna, who's obviously arguing on the Republican side of this, and he says that the Culleton decision is, is part of the basis for this millionaires tax being unconstitutional, according to him. And he thinks the Washington state constitution is very clear and that, that this tax will be thrown out, just to, balance that a little bit.
But Sarah, these are stances that the Supreme Court candidates won't take on the campaign trail this year, right? Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the twist in all of this is that the candidates are not allowed to take stances on the millionaires tax. They're not allowed to talk about how they might rule on potential issues that the court could be seeing in the future. So voters basically have to do their research to suss out how a candidate might rule on certain issues, which, is kind of a pain, a very high stakes pain.
It's a very high stakes pain. It also is the reason we say these races are another reason we say these races are sleepy. The judges, the justices, the candidates, they won't say how they're going to rule because of this. I guess we'll talk about this more in a minute. It seems like to me, from when I read about these candidates, they don't so much run on platforms like a classic candidate. They more run on their resumes. Like I argued this case or I defended this plaintiff. We can get a sense of how they might vote based on their endorsements, right? From state politicians and parties, ones who, who does Jamie Peterson endorse, right? I think, there was a really close race last cycle in 2024 where now Supreme Court Justice Sal Mangia was running. It was an open seat. Sal Mangia was endorsed by the state Democratic Party and a bunch of other state Democrats, including former governors. His opponent in the race, Dave Larson, who's also a judge, he was endorsed by the Republican Party. He did not put that on his website or tout it in the campaign. But if I were a Democrat or somebody who wants a more left-leaning justice on the court, that race in 2024 would scare me because, again, Larson, the more conservative candidate, only lost by less than 20,000 votes.
It was so close.
Yeah, despite the fact that Democrats and their allies spent almost 3 times the amount of money to elect Larson's opponent. Larson is running again this year against a different incumbent. But Sarah, have the endorsements started coming down the pipeline in these elections yet?
So officially, no, but there are some signals from those who have been doing their research. For one, a source sent me a screenshot from Full Court Press, which is Rob McKenna's nonprofit that trains people to be judges. But basically, Full Court Press initially endorsed candidates running for different judge positions on their website, and they've since taken that page down, maybe after there were some concerns that seeing a Full Court Press endorsement, which is essentially a conservative endorsement, might actually hurt a candidate's chances in these races. But from the looks of the screenshot, they were supporting Dave Larson, who you just mentioned, and Sean O'Donnell, who's a King County Appeals Court judge. Again, Larson is running against an incumbent in position 5, and O'Donnell is one of the newcomers for the open position 4 race, running against Ian Burke, a state appeals court judge. But since the right-leaning endorsements aren't up online anymore, the only real fragment that remains of all of this is a $500 donation to Sean O'Donnell's campaign from Rob McKenna himself, the guy litigating against the millionaires tax.
Okay, interesting.
We're kind of combing through some clues as to where these judicial candidates might fall on the ideological spectrum. But I mean, oftentimes they don't fit into this neat left-right lane, right? Like that position 4 race that you just mentioned doesn't have an incumbent. O'Donnell is getting some money from Rob McKenna, but both he and his opponent, Ian Burke, are really trying to say, we are moderate progressives. They both want that lane. What do you make of that, Sarah?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say to most folks watching, these two candidates do seem pretty evenly matched, and campaign fundraising shows similar numbers. Ian Burke is slightly ahead right now, but I think they could both be categorized as moderates. So I think maybe folks might be surprised to hear that O'Donnell was endorsed by Full Court Press, the conservative group that we just talked about. Ian Burke clearly has the support of trial lawyers who some feel are unfairly throwing their money and influence around. These groups have made a lot of money from pricey litigation against the state that's added to the state's budget woes. Some of Burke's top donors are powerful trial attorney firms, so that's something to at least be aware of as a voter. Neither of these candidates for the open position 4 race is allowed to comment on how they'd rule on taxes, but detractors to O'Donnell have pointed out that he's gotten an endorsement and campaign contribution from Rob McKenna, and that should give us a sense of how he might rule on the millionaires tax.
Allegedly.
Maybe.
Allegedly.
I think Rob McKenna, just because you got a donation from Rob McKenna, I think McKenna donated to Nick Brown, the Attorney General.
Yeah.
So he does donate to Democrats sometimes.
Great point. Yeah. But O'Donnell's history also shows that he worked with longtime Republican Senator and former AG Slade Gordon. So maybe just some other things to consider. I've heard from some political consultants that candidates can sometimes try to hide as a wolf in sheep's clothing in these races because they are nonpartisan.
I'm assuming those are liberal political consultants, because
Yes.
if you're liberal in this state, you don't need to really, if you're endorsed by Democrats.
You don't need to hide.
Yeah, it's the conservatives who are like maybe trying to hide it a little bit more so they can get more votes. These, I will say, you can't always tell how the voters are going to go on these races because of the low voter info. Justice Charles Johnson, who is one of this year's retirees, right? He's actually age limited out of running for re-election. I think he turned 75 at some point this year.
In March.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
and then you have to retire
birthday.
by the end of the calendar year when you turn 75.
A happy late birthday, Justice Charles Johnson. You must retire. I think, I bring him up because he was elected in 1990 for the first time in an election that newspapers dubbed the fluke of the decade. He was just an unknown divorce lawyer. He didn't even mount a campaign for state Supreme Court, and people were totally baffled when he won and beat an incumbent, respected justice. One theory at the time was that voters might have confused him with a prominent King County Superior Court judge, also named Charles Johnson. I mean, but that honestly is like maybe giving voters a little bit of credit.
That's what happens when you have these low participation races, right? Every single vote carries more weight. And when people are using random metrics like, hey, that guy's name looks good or it sounds familiar, you just never know what can happen.
I do think this is a really interesting place to point out just how unusual Washington state is, that regular citizens, voters, have so much power in electing state Supreme Court justices. Yeah. Washington is only one of 14 states in the country that does it this way. And I'm told that Washington candidates abide far more strictly than other states do to keep these races nonpartisan, which is basically the reason why so many people have trouble figuring out who to vote for in the first place. I'm told other states have systems like either having a partisan Supreme Court race or having the governor appoint judges or having voters vote on the governor's appointments. And polling data shows that in the 2024 election, which was a presidential election, meaning that voter turnout was especially high, there was a 33% drop-off in votes for Supreme Court judges versus votes for the U.S. president. So people just skipped over this part of the ballot when they got there, presumably because they had no idea who to vote for.
1 in 3 people.
Yeah, a third of people not voting on this super consequential race. You know, sir, you said that Washington state is unique in, the fact that, or rare in the fact that citizens have so much say. I would say that there's an argument to be made that we do have a de facto system of gubernatorial appointments. And that's a gripe that conservatives, will raise. And I agree that it often turns out that way. Two incumbents who are running for election this year, Colleen Melody and Theo Angelis, were just appointed by Governor Ferguson to fill vacancies left by retirements. When justices decide to retire in the middle of their terms, it leads to these opportunities for the governor to appoint and then give that person the incumbency advantage so that it'll stay state Supreme Court justice next to their name on the ballot. Right. And honestly, I think it's notable that all the justices didn't do that. And, these two justices, Charles Johnson and Raquel Montoya Lewis, decided, no, I want to serve out the rest of my term and let the voters decide in an open election.
Give nobody that state Supreme Court justice next to their name
Yeah,
on the ballot.
and take that power and leave it with the voters rather than the governor. But I'm wondering, just as we're wrapping here, Sarah, since we do have so many judge positions up on the ballot this year, and there's going to be more energy, this is a midterm election, like, does that mean it gets overshadowed, or could there be more sizzle because of how consequent, am I being too hopeful? More sizzle because of how big of a deal 5 seats could truly shift the court here, and will people actually pay attention?
I hate to say this, but I think we'll all be watching to see. Folks have said the fact that we're all talking about these November races in April definitely points to there being something in the air. There's absolutely something. I mean, even just from a non-expert perspective, I think anyone could tell you that 5 Supreme Court justice seats up for election is a lot and enough to make folks pay attention. But it's expected that we might see these races kind of start to rack up a lot of money, maybe more money than is typically raised for these sorts of Supreme Court races. And we'll start to see that behind certain candidates, depending on what interest groups support them as we get closer to November. But some interest groups might play it pretty close to the chest until the very end in an effort to be strategic. So we will have to see what happens there.
Yeah. And there will be more to talk about. I mean, we don't really know yet who. We only have some basic, if I understand it correctly, like gestures about who the unions are supporting, right? The unions are a big interest group. They're going to be spending money. They already are. It just hasn't all been reported, I think, yet. The Washington Observer last Friday talked about a primary for position 3, which we did not discuss, and how the unions are trying to pick their horse. There's like 2 liberal horses in that race, liberal candidates, I should say, in that race. And, I think...
I would trust a horse on the Supreme Court, personally.
And what would you name that horse? Can you,
I would name it...
You come up with a good horse race name?
Justice.
Justice.
And they would vote nay on everything. 2 claps for yes, 1 clap for no.
Mr. Ed spinoff in the year 2026. Yes. You know what? I think it's time to go. I had a thing I was going to say. It's jumped out of my head. I think we should end there. I had something I was going to say about Ferguson. One of those appointees worked with him very closely. But
Colleen Melody,
yes.
She was part of the AG's office.
She worked with him on Trump's travel ban in 2017. She ran his civil rights division. Mm-hmm. Important stuff. We will talk about it all. But I think, that's where we end it, yeah? Sarah, thanks for joining us this week.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
That's it for Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone. Our editor is Kat Smith. Our producer is Hans Anderson.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. And I do think the state Supreme Court races are a huge deal, despite me being a little jokey about it. It's just the way to Trojan horse in all the facts, right? The comedy is the way to get people to pay attention.
I just want the listeners to know I tried to get us out of here before they went way over. Way.
Okay, this show is only possible, everybody, because of your support. We say it every week. It's true. Please consider a donation at KUOW.org/politics, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.